Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a document that has cast, well, an incredibly long, often debated shadow across history. It sparked revolutions, inspired movements, and really shaped political talk for over a century and a half. We're talking about the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Our mission today, to guide you through its pretty dense historical and theoretical landscape, we want to reveal its surprising origins, really dissect its central arguments, and trace its enduring influence on global history. And to do that, our sources are particularly rich. Fascinating prefaces, earlier drafts, even later addresses from the authors themselves, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It gives us this unique window into how it was made and how it evolved.
Indeed. It's a profound journey, really, into the intellectual currents of the mid-19th century and beyond. We'll explore not just what the manifesto says, but maybe more importantly, why it says it, and how that initial message was received and, reinterpreted over time. It offers a powerful lens, I think, to understand the dramatic shifts of industrial society and the birth of these new political ideas. So, let's unpack this together.
Okay, so let's start right at the very beginning. This wasn't just some sudden burst of inspiration, was it?
No, not at all.
The manifesto actually began as a program for a specific group, the Communist League, late 1847, but it almost looked completely different.
That's right. What's fascinating here is that its earliest drafts were structured almost like a religious catechism.
A catechism, like questions and answers.
Exactly. We have documents like Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith and Principles of Communism that show this Q&A format. But Engels, in this really pivotal letter to Marx in November 1847, he explicitly suggested abandoning it for a manifesto. He argued the catechism was, quote, unsuitable for expressing the broad, dynamic, revolutionary movement that was, starting to emerge across Europe.
So that pivot from a catechism to a manifesto seems like a crucial strategic choice then.
Absolutely.
What did Engels mean when he said it was unsuitable? How did the manifesto format better serve their goals right then?
Well, it was about reaching a wider, more engaged audience. A catechism implies this fixed doctrine you just learned.
Right.
Whereas a manifesto is a public declaration. It's a call to action. It needed to be a comprehensive formulation of the aims and historic tasks of the labor movement.
Okay, so it's more of a rallying cry.
Exactly. And it came off the press at the end of February 1848. A slim 23-page pamphlet, dark green cover apparently, and it hit at precisely the right moment. Revolutions were kicking off across Europe. Within months, it was being reprinted. And efforts were already underway to translate it into Danish, Polish, Swedish, all in that same year, 1848.
Wow, that's incredibly fast for the mid-19th century, just bang, bang, bang.
It really was.
But then there seems to have been a period where maybe it wasn't quite as widely known. I'm curious, when did it truly gain its international stride? What made it eventually become so widespread?
You're right. There was a bit of a lag. Interestingly, the first English translation by Helen Macfarlane didn't appear until 1850. And even then, it was in a Chartist journal, kind of niche. And for a long time, the authors actually remained anonymous.
Anonymous.
Yeah, almost like a secret document for a while. It wasn't really until the 1870s, as the proletariat struggle became more organized, more visible, that new editions truly exploded onto the scene. That's when you get the first American and Russian ones, the Russian one famously translated by Mikhail Bakunin.
Bakunin. Wasn't he a major opponent of Marx?
He absolutely was. Which tells you something about the manifesto's perceived importance, even by its critics.
That is quite a twist. And after Marx's death, Engels really took on this role, didn't he? Guardian and editor of the manifesto.
He did.
Preparing prefaces, the 1888 English version. What does his dedication tell us about how the manifesto's significance was maybe changing for the movement itself?
It tells us everything, really. Engels became its living historian, its interpreter. He meticulously tracked its spread. He observed its circulation increase precisely in proportion to the expansion of large-scale industry in a country.
So more industry, more manifesto readers.
Exactly. It showed a direct correlation with the growing demand among workers to understand their own position, their own power. He called it, and this is quite a claim, the most widespread, the most international production of all socialist literature. So this constant re-editing, re-prefacing, it shows the manifesto wasn't static. It needed to be continually recontextualized for a living movement.
And a crucial point you touched on earlier that Engels also highlighted was the very different meanings of socialist and communist back in 1847. Why was it so vital for them to specifically say communist?
Yeah, this is key to understanding their radical stance at the time. In 1847, socialists were often seen as adherents of these utopian systems.
Like Owenites, Fourierists, people planning ideal little communities.
Exactly. Often detached from the actual working class. Or they were seen as, quote, social quacks, trying to patch up society's problems without any danger to capital and profit. These were generally middle-class movements, often looking for support from the educated classes, respectable. Communism, on the other hand, was seen as raw, working class, crude, rough-hewn, purely instinctive, as Engels put it, and definitely not respectable.
The opposite of respectable.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So for Marx and Engels, who were completely committed to the idea that the emancipation of the workers must be the act of the working class itself, choosing communist was deliberate. It was defiant. It was an embrace of the working class as the only agent of real change.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's dive into the core text itself, specifically that famous first section, Bourgeois and Proletarians. It opens with that absolute bombshell. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Wow. What did they mean by bourgeoisie and proletariat here, and how did they see this struggle shaping modern times?
Yeah, it's a powerful opening. And for Marx and Engels, this historical struggle had basically simplified, crystallized into two main forces in modern society. You have the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. They own the means of production, factories, land, capital. And then you have the proletariat, the working class, who own basically nothing but their ability to work, their labor power, which they have to sell to survive.
Owners versus workers, essentially.
Simplest form, yes. The manifesto presents history not just as events, but as this continuous fight between oppressor and oppressed, freeman and slave, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, and now bourgeois and proletarian.
And what's really counterintuitive, maybe, is how the manifesto almost seems to admire the bourgeoisie in a way. It credits them with this profoundly revolutionary role.
It does, and that's often overlooked. It describes how this class rose from medieval serfs and townspeople, propelled by things like the discovery of America, global trade, the steam engine, leading to modern industry, the world market.
It doesn't hold back on their achievements?
Not at all. What's fascinating is how it outlines their destructive and productive force. It says the bourgeoisie has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, replacing them with naked self-interest, callous cash payment. It turned doctors, lawyers, priests, poets into paid wage laborers. It even accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals.
So it acknowledges their immense power.
Immense. But the core insight here is that this very success, this relentless drive for expansion, for efficiency, it inherently creates the conditions for its own collapse. It's like a self-cannibalizing dynamic.
That's a powerful image they use, the sorcerer losing control of the spells they've conjured.
Exactly.
But if the bourgeoisie was so revolutionary and powerful, what made Marx and Engels so certain that this overproduction, this creation of the proletariat, would inevitably lead to their downfall? Couldn't it just be another cycle of crisis and adaptation?
They argue it's different this time. The bourgeoisie is like that sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers. He is called up by his spells. It's created productive forces so huge that they outgrow the existing property relations, the capitalist system itself. This leads to these recurring commercial crises, marked by what they call the epidemic of overproduction.
Too much stuff, basically.
Too much civilization, too much subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce, as they put it. For Marx and Engels, this wasn't just a temporary blip. It was an inherent contradiction baked into the system. The very weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself.
And the weapons are?
Well, the productive forces, but even more critically, the people needed to operate those forces. It has called into existence the men who are clear to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians.
So the proletariat is the bourgeoisie's special and essential product created by the very system that exploits them.
Precisely. A class of laborers who have to sell themselves piecemeal, like a commodity, subject to all the ups and downs of the market.
But how does this scattered group of individuals competing for jobs become a unified revolutionary force? How do they pick up those weapons?
The manifesto explains it as a process. As industry grows, the lower middle class, small shopkeepers, artisans, peasants, they often can't compete with big capital. They sink into the proletariat, making it larger and more diverse. Initially, any unity they have might just be a consequence of the bourgeoisie using them for its own political fights, say, against the old aristocracy.
So the bourgeoisie kind of trains them unintentionally.
In a way, yes. But the shared harsh conditions, the competition among workers, that also pushes them together. It leads gradually to stronger, more organized groups, eventually forming a political party. And the bourgeoisie, in its own internal battles or fights with foreign rivals, is forced to appeal to the proletariat for help, thereby unintentionally giving them political education and, crucially, weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie.
That's a fascinating dynamic. So this leads the manifesto to conclude that of all the classes that stand face-to-face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. What makes them uniquely revolutionary compared to, say, the struggling small shopkeepers?
Well, the key distinction they make is about trajectory. Those other classes, the petty bourgeoisie, they're fighting to save their disappearing way of life, their small property. So they're often conservative or even reactionary. If they do become revolutionary, the manifesto argues, it's only because they see they're about to become proletarians. They're adopting the future perspective.
Okay.
The proletariat, however, is already without property in the bourgeois sense. Its mission isn't to gain that kind of property, but to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. Its position as a movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority.
And the bourgeoisie, in this view, becomes unfit to rule.
Yes. Because it can't even guarantee a basic survival for its workers. It's slave within his slavery, as they put it. Therefore, the conclusion is stark. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable.
Equally inevitable. Okay, given this analysis of an inevitable rise, what actions or transformations did the manifesto actually propose? It tackles some big objections right away, like the fear of abolishing private property. How does it handle that?
It confronts it directly. The manifesto clarifies that its conclusions aren't just made-up ideas, but they morally express actual relations springing from an existing class struggle. And crucially, it's not about abolishing property in general, but specifically the abolition of bourgeois property.
Okay, what's the difference there? Bourgeois property versus other kinds.
Bourgeois property is property used to generate profit by exploiting the labor of others, like factories, capital. The manifesto argues that in the society of 1848, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population.
Meaning most people didn't own productive property anyway.
Exactly. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. So the goal isn't to take away personal belongings, but to transform capital, this social power, into common property, to change its social character, make it lose its class character.
That distinction is vital. But what about other really common accusations, then and now? Abolishing the family, abolishing nationality. Those are huge claims.
They are, and the manifesto tackles them head-on in a section that's, well, pretty provocative. Regarding the abolition of the family, it claims the present family, the bourgeois family, is based on capital, on private gain. It argues that for proletarians, the traditional family often barely exists in practice, may be supplemented by public prostitution.
Oof. Strong words.
Very. It asserts the bourgeois family will vanish with the vanishing of capital. As for the outcry about a supposed community of women, the manifesto calls the accusation ridiculous. It argues the bourgeoisie already treats wives as mere instruments of production, and that a kind of community of women, through prostitution and affairs, has existed almost from time immemorial.
So it's flipping the accusation back.
Exactly. It says the real communist aim is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. That phrase itself, instruments of production applied to women, is quite jarring, really showing how radically it challenged the norms of the time.
Definitely. And nationality, abolishing countries.
It's a bit more abstract there. It suggests that as material life changes, so do ideas and social connections. National divisions, it implies, are already being undermined by capitalism's global market and will fade further under communism. Workers have no country in the bourgeois sense, it claims.
So the overarching idea is that the communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas.
That sums it up well.
Okay, so once the working class becomes the ruling class, wins the battle of democracy, what are some concrete, immediate steps the manifesto suggests to start this whole transformation?
Right. It lists 10 measures. It does say these are generally applicable in most advanced countries, acknowledging they might need adaptation.
Okay, what are some examples?
Well, things like abolition of property and land and rent going to public purposes, a heavy progressive income tax, abolition of all rights of inheritance.
Wow, okay. Keep going.
Confiscation of property from immigrants and rebels. Centralization of credit. Think a national bank. Centralization of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Expanding state-owned factories. Cultivating wastelands. Equal liability of all to work. Creating industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Combining agriculture with manufacturing industries. And finally, free education for all children in public schools, combined with industrial production.
That is quite a comprehensive list. And the ultimate goal of all this?
The ultimate aim is that when class distinctions have disappeared and production is concentrated in the hands of associated individuals, then the public power will lose its political character. The state, as an instrument of class rule, would wither away.
Right. Now, the manifesto doesn't just lay out its own vision. It spends a good chunk of time critiquing other socialist ideas floating around back then. Can you walk us through those different flavors of socialism and why Marx and Engels found them lacking?
Certainly. They categorize what they call socialist and communist literature into three main types. And yeah, their critiques are pretty sharp. First, there's reactionary socialism. This is kind of an umbrella term.
Okay.
It includes feudal socialism. Basically, aristocrats moaning about the rise of the bourgeoisie, but really just wanting their old feudal privileges back, even while they profit from industry. Then there's petty bourgeois socialism. This is the socialism of the small shopkeeper or peasant. Classes being crushed by big capital, trying to roll back history or preserve their precarious position. So ultimately reactionary in Marx and Engels' view. And then a very specific target, German or true socialism.
True socialism, what was that about?
They accused German philosophers of taking French socialist ideas, stripping them of their practical class-based meaning, and turning them into abstract philosophical jargon about human nature and universal love. They felt it emasculated the actual class struggle.
So basically they saw these as backward-looking or missing the point about class? What about conservative or bourgeois socialism? That sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, and that's precisely their point. This type, the manifesto explains, represents parts of the bourgeoisie who want the benefits of modern society without the messy struggles and dangers that come with it. They desire a bourgeoisie without a proletariat, or at least a proletariat that accepts its place quietly.
So keep the system, just tweak it a bit to stop people complaining.
Essentially, yes. They want the proletariat to stay within existing society, but just cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie, be a happy, non-revolutionary workforce.
And finally, critical utopian socialism and communism. How did the manifesto view folks like Owen or Fourier? Were they just naive dreamers?
They viewed them as important early figures representing the first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends. But they argued these attempts necessarily failed because the proletariat itself was still undeveloped and the necessary economic conditions weren't there yet.
So ahead of their time, maybe.
In a sense. But the critique is that these thinkers ended up dreaming of experimental realization of their social utopias. These isolated communities, monsters and home colonies, they ended up appealing to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois for funding, rather than focusing on mobilizing the working class for revolutionary change. So they ultimately sink into the category of the reactionary or conservative socialists because their approach bypasses the class struggle.
Okay, that makes sense. Moving from all that theory to actual practice, our sources also really dive into a pivotal real-world event that massively impacted Marx's thinking, the Paris Commune of 1871. What was the big deal about the Commune for him?
Oh, it was hugely significant. Marx wrote the Civil War in France, sometimes called the Paris Commune, as an address to the International Workingmen's Association right after it happened. And it's crucial because it contains really the only major revisions or clarifications to his political vision made during his lifetime that came directly from observing the working class in action.
Wow. So what did he see in it?
He saw the Commune as the direct antithesis to the existing French state, the Second Empire, which he saw as purely serving capital against labor. The Commune, for him, was essentially a working class government. It was the product of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, and crucially, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor.
The political form at last discovered. So he saw it as a kind of template, a living blueprint.
In a way, yes, though maybe not a rigid one. It wasn't some pre-planned utopia dropped from the sky. It emerged from struggle. He highlighted how it embodied cheap government by getting rid of the standing army and the huge state bureaucracy, replacing them with elected, recallable officials, paid workers' wages. It provided a basis for really democratic institutions.
And economically, what was its aim?
Its aim, he argued, was to abolish class property, the bourgeois property we talked about, to transform the means of production into mere instruments of free and associated labor. This he tentatively called possible communism.
Possible communism. Interesting phrasing. And you mentioned earlier it even got support from some non-proletarians.
That's right, which is fascinating. Significant parts of the Paris middle class, shopkeepers, tradesmen, artisans, actually supported the commune initially. Why? Because the commune addressed their economic grievances too, like debts and rents, issues exacerbated by the previous regime. It offered them an alternative to the economic ruin they faced under the empire.
It really paints a picture of a radically different Paris, doesn't it? There's that striking quote in the source.
Oh yeah, about the change in the city.
Yes. No longer any trace of the tawdry Paris of the Second Empire. No longer was Paris the rendezvous of British landlords. No more corpses at the morgue. No nocturnal burglaries. Scarcely any robberies. In fact, for the first time since February 1848, the streets of Paris were safe, and that without any police of any kind.
It's a remarkable claim, isn't it? It highlights the profound impact the Commune had, or was perceived to have, on daily life and public order. It contrasts so sharply with the chaotic, phantom Paris described by its opponents, like the government leader Thiers, who eventually crushed it brutally. The Commune, despite its tragic end after only about 2 months, was presented by Marx as this vital, living example of the working class taking its emancipation into its own hands, learning as it went, without needing ready-made utopias. It was a practical lesson.
What a journey we've taken, really, through the history and core ideas of the manifesto of the Communist Party. From that deliberate shift away from a catechism to a public declaration to its, fierce analysis of the bourgeoisie as both revolutionary and self-destructive, and its bold and still controversial vision for a classless society. This document has undeniably left just an indelible mark on the world.
It really has. And seeing how the manifesto itself wasn't static, how it evolved through those many editions and prefaces Engels oversaw, and then how its ideas were tested, refined, maybe even changed by events like the Paris Commune. It really underscores how historical documents aren't just fixed objects. They live, they breathe, they reflect and influence the changing conditions of society and the movements they inspire. It's a reminder that even foundational texts are part of a much larger ongoing conversation, aren't they?
Absolutely. It's truly a testament to the power of ideas, maybe the enduring power to shape history, even when, or perhaps especially when, those ideas are controversial or widely misunderstood.
So as you reflect on all this, what stands out to you from our deep dive today? How do the manifesto's ideas about class struggle or the role of the bourgeoisie or the very nature of property, how do they resonate or maybe clash with your understanding of the world around you now? That's perhaps something to ponder as you navigate your own well-informed path.